It's another Manly Monday, and you notice I sound different this Manly Monday. I possibly have COVID. Not sure. My husband definitely has COVID. I'm still testing negative, but I do have symptoms, and I've been told, well, it can take multiple days after you start presenting symptoms to test positive. So I don't know how this week is going to go. My priority is making sure I'm well enough to do the Leanna Care sessions on Wednesday and Thursday. I mean, the nice thing about those being over Zoom is no matter what, I'm not going to infect anybody. But if I'm not present, right, I'm not going to just show up to show up, right? So I'm going to try to get better by then, which means there may not be content tomorrow or Wednesday. I almost didn't do content today, but I finally managed to take a shower. First time I felt well enough to take a shower in a couple of days. I've been taking baths and it's just like so awful. But I finally managed to take a shower today and I felt better. That's when my hair's still wet. Not that it's abnormal for me to do videos when my hair is wet. I just don't give a shit about this stuff. But yeah, I sound different because I'm not at my best. But we're going to soldier on. Ironically. By the way, Thunderbolts movie is official. I'm super stoked if you've been following the Comic-Con news. Super excited. I'm super excited that there's going to be a Thunderbolts movie in the MCU. But that has nothing to do with this. Well, it kind of does. If you like this sort of stuff, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Or buy a one-time Leanna Care session from someone who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/LeannaK. This question was actually from Leanna Care's client. He asked me to discuss male warrior hypothesis. And this is a commonly misunderstood thing. And we are delving into one of my least favorite topics regarding gender, which is evolutionary psychology. However, the particular evolutionary psychologist that coined the term male warrior hypothesis is actually a pretty good one, but this is actually a guy's work that you can't take just one piece of and go, oh, I got it. There's a whole bunch of interlinking stuff that you need to apply to really understand what the various things do. His name is, I am going to pronounce it wrong because it's a Dutch name, but Mark van Voot. He's that's Van Voot, Vugt, and I'm not getting the name right, but I can't add ABBA to that pronunciation. Though they're Norwegian, Swedish. Oh my God. Okay. But what I find, the work I find most interesting that this PhD works on is his ideas on evolutionary mismatch and the idea that society has changed so quickly that evolutionary urges, certain biological things that used to help us now get in the way because the world has moved faster than evolutionary adaptations have caught up to. And the classic example of that is fast food, right? That human brains like high calorie food. That's what we find most tasty. But food is now so plentiful that this is a problem, right? So, we're required to show restraint in a way that for tens of thousands of years we didn't have to. And so we have this issue on many fronts. His stuff about postpartum depression is really interesting. The fact that the world and the expectations on new mothers are so out of sync with what what went on, that he argues that that's why postpartum depression is a thing, namely a lack of social resources. Now, of course, infant mortality also used to be way higher. So, you know, and that's the challenge with all of this stuff, with anything with evolutionary psychology. If you're not careful, you can make it seem to say anything you want it to, because it is so, it's dealing with large groups of people. It can be helpful to an individual understanding their personal struggle, but it can be catastrophic when it's applied to suggest that any individual should be something or is damaged or flawed because they are not this thing. That's not how it works. And on top of that, the male warrior hypothesis gets misconstrued. A lot of people talk about it as, oh, it's the evolutionary proof that men are more violent and aggressive, which isn't actually what it's not that simple, right? It's about what they call coalitional aggression between groups of men and the way outgroups are perceived. So, but again, that can be used to, it's about threat assessments of outgroups and the willingness to behave aggressively towards, as they say, males of an identifiable outgroup. And they have linked this to, from everything to, warfare and violence and aggression and xenophobia. And obviously we start, or as I say, ethnocentricity, which, is a pretty word for racism. Hence me saying you got to be really careful with this stuff. Read one way, read in a particular way, male warrior hypothesis can be used to prove, radical feminism is 100% right about everything. MRA theory is totally wrong. Men are inherently more violent. Men are unfit fathers. They're just not wired for it. That's one thing people do with it. It's not that simple. And this is why when this Leanna Cares client asked me to talk about it, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to be real careful though. If one person is asking about it, other people are going to be interested in it, but how do I handle this? Because there is absolutely no way to apply this particular hypothesis in microcosm to any particular modern social issue without, implications about other social issues that we just know not to be true, right? And this is where we get into the lack of nuance that tends to overwhelm uses of evolutionary psychology. Instead of using evolutionary psychology to understand the mismatches between what our lizard brains are doing and, what especially modern workplaces require us to do, it ends up being, oh, men are more violent. Video games make you violent because they tap into aggression and all that stuff. We know that's not true, right? And we know that lots of men are great fathers, want to spend more time with their kids, so on and so forth. So I don't like, this is why I don't like getting into allegedly hardwired binaries this way. Because if you dig into the research, and I have linked to one paper because it's not paywalled as best I can tell, it's on nature.com, which, okay, some people might have issues with that. Um, but it shows, if you want to read some very, very dense language, how complicated, not just measuring different types of testosterone levels is, but also measuring how exactly this coalitional aggression works in, big picture, right? Um, Armies historically have been overwhelmingly male. Um, and the argument is, oh, that's because men evolved to want to take one group and fight with sticks with another group. But, there's also things like carrying capacity and the fact that during the world wars, women were actively excluded from, frontline duties. If men just naturally wanted to do the stuff and didn't, why did that exclusion have to be there? Makes you wonder, right? Why would they just not allow a few key outliers to participate as well, the way they did back in the day before we started so rigidly enforcing this stuff? And that rigid enforcement is what you have to be really, really careful with when you're going, aha, there's a biological component, or aha, there's an evolutionary psychological component. It's really important to understand what our brains are designed to do. I find it really helpful to remind myself that I don't have a typically female brain. But then I look at like the paper that I linked to, and they measure prenatal testosterone based on the comparative length of your ring finger and your index finger on your right hand. Now, if one's longer than the other, it means one thing. If the other's longer than it's all in the paper, but mine are the exact same goddamn size. No help for me, right? It's things like that some would say, oh, well, that shows you're not typically female and all that stuff. If we're going to start measuring finger length to decide where to sort people in society, we might as well go back to shit like phrenology, okay? It's just not among large groups. It may be useful. But when it comes to what you assume about individuals and how you treat individuals, it doesn't work so well. Which is why I get incredibly when various gendered political groups start using evolutionary psychology or biological factors to prove their side. It just isn't that simple. The problem isn't the science. The problem is the interpretation of it. And, for instance, one of the suggestions that mismatch theory leads to is the idea that people at work should have to have more face-to-face time. And, everybody on the autism spectrum is going, oh God, no, please. Introverts are going, oh God, no, please. Right? You can't take a theory about things as complicated as people and apply it to everybody. You also can't take things like this and start going, someone is more or less manly based on their comparisons to these scales, right? Individual results may vary. A huge amount of this stuff is social conditioning. I'm living proof, right? I grew up in an environment where you had to learn to be more aggressive. And so I am. And so I was a meek little thing compared to my female peer group growing up. But, compared to the average non-Karen-y white woman, not so much. And my form of aggression is much more direct. Like, if I got something to say to you, I'll say to you. I'm not, I don't do the speak to your manager kind of shit. It's like, look, let's work it out. I'm not going to come at you unless you come at me. Right? But there is definitely something to this in-group, out-group thing. But again, this is something that we need to understand. And I'm going to proceed very, very cautiously with this, because if I botch explaining this, shit could go sideways. And obviously I'm not feeling well. But it's not as simple as, men more aggressive because testosterone. There's all this stuff about competition for mates and mating. And obviously with modern technology, this isn't a thing anymore. Now, that doesn't mean people's brains don't still work like it is. But then that doesn't really explain things like the men going their own way movements, or women who don't want children, because of course, according to evolutionary psychology, every woman wants children because that's what we're designed to be wired to want. And obviously, it's just not the case on an individual basis, right? It is also not the case that even the most, it's not the case that this sort of fighting over women, fighting over the women folk is as described or as we see it in the movies, right? It was more, according to the stuff I've seen, group, like RVR in gaming. It's like group versus group. It was factional warfare. And most people see it as more one guy competing with another guy to fighting over a girl. And while, there is some of that, you don't see the cut and dried stuff as you do with the groups. And the other interesting thing is in the paper I linked to, they say that one group being more formidable or being more powerful, they don't see an increase or a decrease in the aggression of the men in a group based on the relative power of that group, which is really interesting because it indicates there's either a limit to how much this stuff works, or it works in a way that we don't quite understand yet. And the other thing I found very interesting is the studies they did on fear responses, which is not something that people tend to link with testosterone, right? But they actually found that, I'll read this right here. Conditioned fear responses to images of out-group males were far more difficult to extinguish than conditioned fear responses to out-group females or in-group members of either sex, as measured by conductivity tests of perspiration on the skin. These results held true whether the participant was male or female. So that means that fear of the other is something that they measured in women as well as men. Fear of men of the outgroup was something that was higher in women and men, which isn't necessarily explained by male warrior hypothesis, right? It makes sense based on general, hey, that, bigger threat to here. We all sort of know these things, but there's an example of the perceived threat of a strange man. This is what I'm talking about let's not jump to conclusions here, regarding what the social solution is for this. And this is why I'm so careful about this stuff, right? Because the easy assumption to jump to is, well, men are just inherently scary. Nobody can help it. So women's only spaces, safe spaces, they make sense, right? Not necessarily so. Because the only way we train our brains away from that fear response that doesn't do us a heck of a lot of good anymore, the brain's very elastic, is safe associations with those so-called outgroup males. So you find out they're not so scary. It didn't say it was impossible to extinguish conditioned fear responses. It said it was more difficult. It can be done. And this is where jumping to conclusions about what this stuff means, the data's the same no matter what outcome you subscribe to, whether it's the radical feminist turf. We must have safe spaces for women because men are inherently dangerous. You can argue that science shows that, that's a very difficult fear to get rid of and women deserve to be safe. But you can also use that exact same data to argue that fear is a leftover from when we lived in fucking caves, man. And then they'll jump to another statistic and another statistic, and they create this patchwork of evidence that doesn't really solve something as complex as a social problem in a society that's supposed to value rights of the minority, not just the feeling of safety of the majority. And that's the problem with the era we're in. I think that a lot of political forces, and this is why I decided it was a good idea to do this video, even though it is incredibly difficult to explain in a short period of time. Why I think it's very important to talk about this, because I do think that various political forces and various social activist groups are leveraging fear of outsiders, fear of outgroup, especially fear of outgroup males, to make people act against their best interests. They know that fear is incredibly difficult to extinguish. It overrides the logic of people. And that's why it's very important to point out that, well, the observed evidence said other things too. Interestingly, apparently, women are most likely to fear outgroup males during peak fertility in her menstrual cycle. Interesting. I don't know how that women get more scared when, they can have a baby. All right. That's an interesting data point. But again, are you actually more likely to be assaulted during that 2-day period? Well, no. See what I mean? Fear is not fact. Another thing they have found, and this is a very touchy one, like I said off the top, about the amount of the difference in reproductive strategies, what they call energetic costs regarding reproduction between men and women. And this is the stuff that gets used against men in terms of parenting. And that's why I'm not even going to go into it, because I'm not a believer in it. I don't think there's anything innate in that, and I don't buy with medical science that it's any more than a mental and emotional appendix. It's a mental and emotional lizard brain, right? I do think some men are capable of really deep commitment and some men aren't. And some women are capable and want really deep commitment and some women aren't and don't. And both are fine. just don't mismatch, right? I also think non-binary people are, well, individuals, right? Some non-binary people very much want a committed relationship, others don't. On the individual level, it is always folly to say, well, science says you should be this, so the fuck what? They're not. You know, if people only worked the way evolutionary science say we should work, all of Silicon Valley would not exist, because computer coders apparently would feel the need to get up and run around every 20 minutes, when of course computer coders don't, right? They're like hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, right? Imagine you're that guy, or less commonly that gal, and you're told, oh no, you have to take breaks at set intervals. I actually talked to somebody who is in tech, and their company just changed that policy, so they weren't forced to take breaks when they were on a roll. This is why we really have to be careful when we apply this sort of thing. And again, why I think it's important to understand this stuff, because of course then you can point to other evolutionary psychological theories that say the exact opposite, that, you know, women aren't resource intensive, more high energetic cost with with children, because bonobos who are really promiscuous instead of chimpanzees. And it's like, when you start comparing humans to bonobos and chimpanzees, I should be able to not wear pants in public. Okay, if you're gonna tell me what my behavior should be based on a fucking chimp, I should not have to wear pants. Okay, I should be able to go pants-free Thursdays. Obviously, we can't, right? That's just a joke, okay? Though I really don't like pants. You know what I mean, right? Like, there are just certain things you can't compare humans to anything, but you also can't compare, chimpanzees to gorillas, or obviously there are major genetic differences between a chimpanzee and a human. There are major differences between the brains between a chimpanzee and a human, but people do this chimpanzee and bonobo shit. If you go to the male warrior hypothesis entry on Wikipedia, you will see shit about chimpanzees. Which, we're not talking about the evolution of chimpanzees. We're talking about the evolution of people. And I do think that there is a very good place for this sort of stuff in terms of on an individual point of understanding of, okay, am I having a lizard brain moment? If so, and it's getting in my way of what I want to do, then how do I make that better? And I do think that the real confounding factor, which is the last thing I want to touch on. Hey, I made it through almost listened to the whole video. But this idea that men are hardwired for collaboration, competitive collaboration against an outgroup, and yet the number of studies that come up where adult men just have so many fewer friends than adult women, and there's a male loneliness epidemic, and it's what the hell happened. And I think that this one bucket of evolutionary pseudoscience overwhelmed this other bucket of evolutionary psychology where, men are lone wolves and they're lone predators and they're aggressive and they compete, so men are always adversaries to each other. I think that became popular myth, and that's what people bought into. And we have a lot of studies in adolescent girls and adult women about attitudes towards other women and how basically women don't fucking trust each other. I haven't seen similar studies in men. And what is going on if, in fact, men are wired for cooperation within in-group to compete successfully against an out-group, what the hell happened, right? Why are we not encouraging this sort of camaraderie in men? And at no point does this say these have to be female-free spaces, right? We are obviously doing something here. If it's right and men do seek out companionship, something is obviously very clearly wrong with the way we're socializing our men and boys. It could be other factors. I'm not convinced that it's, I think I don't think it's innate. I think it has something to do with life experience and the pressures we put on men and more socialization and social constructs than it does, this evolutionary psychology, vastly different, much more variance in terms of reproductive outcomes than women. I'm not even going to get into that because, again, fucking chimpanzees. But I do think this stuff, the takeaway, I think, is less helpful to go, oh, men are natural warriors and we should treat them like warriors, and more actually stop looking at the name of the theory. Start looking at what the theory actually says and wonder, if men are naturally cooperative, at least within in-group, why aren't we encouraging more cooperative in-group dynamics instead of competition within in-groups? I mean, there's going to be a certain amount, right? But why aren't we encouraging more collaboration among in-groups? And I have to give it to the Canadians 4x100 relay team for inspiring me on this, because Andre DeGrasse actually didn't do the 200 meter on his own. So he gave up his own personal glory because he was recovering from COVID. So he would be rested for the 4x100 meter, and they won gold. That's the way, according to this stuff, it's supposed to work. Not giving away my shot. You pass the ball, right? I'm curious about what you guys think. Again, there probably won't be more content for last week. My throat's fucking killing me right now. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Or buy a Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/LeannaK. Thanks for watching. This has been, I powered through it, Manly Mondays. Thanks for watching.